For nearly 60 years, Canadian Pacific Airlines and its later incarnations of CP Air and Canadian Airlines International operated as the nation's second largest carrier behind the state-supported Air Canada, proving to be a viable alternative and a strong competitor, as well as leaving an indelible mark on aviation history through its colourful airliners and widespread operations. As its name implies, Canadian Pacific Airlines was founded by its parent company, the Canadian Pacific Railway, which had been established in 1881 and had built a vast network of railroad lines across western and central Canada, which connected British Columbia on the Pacific coast to Ontario and Quebec in the Mid-East, with its operations ranging from top-line passenger express services to vital transcontinental freight trains, both of which ran via mainline routes between major regional centres and along shoestring branch lines through the rough and remote wilderness of the north. However, in order to remain competitive and to provide onward connections to destinations which weren't served by the railway network, Canadian Pacific, taking a lead from the similar railway air services of the UK, which had been established through an agreement between British flag carrier Imperial Airways and the Big Four railway companies, started to purchase privately owned airline operations whose bush pilots had developed northern air routes serving isolated communities from as early as 1939, eventually purchasing 10 bush airlines, Gingercoot Airways and Yukon Southern Air Transport of Vancouver, Canadian Airways and Wings Limited of Winnipeg, Prairie Airways, Moose Jaw and Mackenzie Air Services of Edmonton, Arrow Airways of The Pas, Manitoba, Starrett Airways of Hudson, Ontario, and Quebec Airways and Dominion Skyways of Montreal. On May 16, 1942, Canadian Pacific was allowed, by the federal government, to amalgamate these 10 airlines into one carrier wholly owned by the railway, creating Canadian Pacific Airlines Limited, or CPA, with the company beginning operation on July 1st of the same year, only 6 weeks after its formation, starting work with a fleet of Barclay Grow T-8P-1 twin-engined regional airliners, while during World War II, the airline provided support for the wartime construction of the Alaska Highway, and in 5 provinces the airline operated 7 air observer schools, 1 elementary flight training school, and 5 aircraft repair depots for the British Commonwealth Air Training Plan. In 1947, Grant McConaughey, founder and president of the former Yukon Southern Air Transport, which had been amalgamated into CPA, became president of Canadian Pacific Airlines, and with his extensive knowledge as to the challenges of providing a consistent air service to the remote northwest of Canada, undertook an aggressive expansion of the company's operations, much of this being due to the interference of the Canadian federal government, who, as owners of the state flag carrier Trans-Canada Airlines, found it in their interests to apply limits to the domestic market share and, through international agreements, limits on which countries CPA could fly to, thus barring the carrier from the traditional routes to London and Paris, while also limiting their access to major Canadian corridors such as Vancouver to Toronto and Toronto to New York, forcing the carrier to be creative as to its choice of domestic and overseas destinations. Seeing that TCA were primarily focused on the lucrative transatlantic service to Britain and Europe, as well as serving major cities in the United States, McConaughey noted a severe lack of investment on TCA's part to serve the Far East and the Pacific, and thus, in 1949, moved the CPA company headquarters from its original base at Edmonton to Vancouver in order to open up new air corridors across the Pacific to Japan and the Orient, and to South Pacific destinations including Hawaii and French Polynesia, while also providing an aerial survey division and, from 1951, the No. 10 Repair Depot, or CPA Repairs Limited, in Calgary, for maintenance on aircraft of the Royal Canadian Air Force and the Royal Canadian Navy, while the naming convention among CPA's transcontinental airliners was to dub them the title Empress of, a homage to the names previously given to ocean liners which had belonged to the Canadian Pacific's own steamship company, perhaps the most famous of which was the RMS Empress of Ireland, which sank in under 14 minutes after being struck by the Norwegian collier Storstad in the early hours of May 29, 1914, killing over 1,000 people. Further expansion came with the start of the 1950s, with CPA, again noting a gap in TCA's market coverage, starting operations between several Canadian cities and South America, Mexico, and certain European destinations, as well as providing what domestic services they could between the major cities of Canada in direct competition with TCA, while beyond their scheduled operations, the company introduced charter flights for Canadian and American military personnel during the Korean War. With McConaughey still demanding expansion of the firm in order to remain competitive with TCA, he originally intended to bring the company into the jet age with the de Havilland Comet, the world's first jet airliner, and one which had illustrated vast improvements on smoothness and speed when compared to the likes of the Lockheed Constellation propeller airliner, CPA ordering 1 unit from de Havilland for a pilot study prior to the potential acquisition of a larger fleet to open up corridors between Vancouver, Honolulu, and Sydney. Unfortunately, the single Comet, christened Empress of Hawaii, was undertaking its delivery flight to Sydney via Karachi in Pakistan, when on March 3, 1953, the aircraft crashed on takeoff, killing all 11 people on board and making it the first ever fatal crash of a jet airliner, the cause being due to the pilot not having full experience with night takeoffs in the Comet, and thus raising the nose of the aircraft so high during the takeoff rotation that it had not the lift to successfully climb, causing it to overrun the runway and slam into a 40-foot embankment at around 140 miles an hour. With this, and the later Comet disasters of 1953, CPA opted to decline any further interest in these early jets, instead continuing to focus on its existing Canadair North Star airliners, while placing an order for the Bristol Britannia, a long-range turboprop-powered aircraft which was originally to have been released in 1955, but due to delays in the Britannia program, didn't enter service with CPA until 1958, around the same time as the Boeing 707, a far more successful jet airliner model, was being rolled out across the globe, rendering the likes of the Britannia immediately obsolete. While the Britannia did well on the transcontinental routes and international services across the Atlantic and Pacific, easily outperforming the piston-powered Constellation and Douglas DC-6 equivalents, jet power was clearly the future, and in 1959, CPA placed an order for a contingent of Douglas DC-8 jet airliners, although these wouldn't enter service until 1961 due to persistent drag problems which had to be overcome, the eventual introduction of the longer-range DC-8s being well-timed, as it allowed CPA to open up routes via the Arctic Circle and North Pole from Canada's west coast and Midwest to Amsterdam, while also opening up trans-Pacific services to Sydney via Honolulu and Fiji, as well as to Hong Kong and Shanghai via Tokyo, pushing the company's annual revenue from 3 million Canadian dollars when it was formed in 1942 to 61 million Canadian dollars in 1964, while domestically, CPA used extensions of international flights to connect various Canadian cities as glorified internal services, examples being the run from Hong Kong to Vancouver via Tokyo, continuing to Edmonton, Winnipeg, Toronto, and eventually Montreal. In 1965, during the same year when Trans-Canada Airlines was renamed to Air Canada, Grant McConaughey tragically passed away due to a heart attack while on a business trip to the Douglas factory at Long Beach, California, at the age of 57, his visit having been to open up discussions with Douglas as to the purchase of their extended version of the DC-8 known as the DC-8 Series 61 or Super DC-8, of which the company would ultimately procure several that were christened Space Masters. In 1968, in order to bring the company name into line with the other subsidiaries of the Canadian Pacific Company, Canadian Pacific Airlines was retitled to simply CP Air, and a new livery was adopted, which replaced the simple crimson and cream colours with a striking orange, red and bare metal look, which mimicked the colours of Canadian Pacific's diesel locomotive fleet. While during the late 1960s and into the early 1970s, CP Air continued to focus on its expansion across Europe to destinations Air Canada chose not to serve, using Amsterdam as their main European hub, from which flights would continue to destinations such as Athens, Lisbon, Milan and Rome, as well as several other later destinations, this being complemented by an extensive charter operation during the summer months as CP Air planes were hired out to travel agents for use on the increasingly widespread mass holiday market. Adopting the slogan "Orange is Beautiful," as coined by advertising firm Lippincott and Margaux, CP Air's colourful airliners became a prominent part of the domestic and international aviation scene, with brand new Boeing 737-200s being employed on trunk services into the United States from Vancouver to Seattle, San Francisco and Los Angeles upon their introduction in October 1968, while in 1973, the first wide-bodies entered the fleet in the form of the Boeing 747-200, with 4 units being delivered, while in order to replace their aging Douglas DC-8s on international routes, which did not justify the use of a 747, the DC-8's successor, the Douglas DC-10 Trijet, was introduced from 1979. In February of 1979, amid calls for deregulation of the commercial aviation industry in Canada, on the grounds that the fixed market share of transcontinental flights for Air Canada stymied fair competition, the federal government eliminated its previous limitations, allowing CP Air, for the first time, to operate in direct competition on the vast array of domestic and international routes which had previously been solely the domain of Air Canada, including services to London and Paris, as well as mainline transcontinental routes within Canada itself, resulting in the launch of the Skybus service during the same year, a no-frills service between Toronto, Calgary, Edmonton and Vancouver, operated by DC-8s demoted to this work after their replacement on top-line international routes by DC-10s. While in response to this new free rein to expand its operations, CP Air placed a huge order for new aircraft in order to replace its older Boeing 727s, 747s and Douglas DC-8s. This order including the purchase of 4 of Boeing's upcoming 767-200 twin-jet wide-bodies for their transatlantic services, expected for delivery in 1983. Unfortunately, 1979 was a turbulent year in the aviation industry, as following the Iranian Revolution, the price of fuel spiked dramatically, leaving the commercial airline world in turmoil as operational costs rose and passenger numbers dropped in the ensuing economic recession. CP Air being forced to drop its order for Boeing 767s and make do with the continued use of older models, such as the Boeing 727, which was the mainstay of its primary Californian services between Vancouver, Los Angeles and San Francisco, the company instead opting to purchase the cheaper Boeing 737-300, which would eventually be delivered in April 1985. While in order to reduce costs on its international routes, in 1986, CP Air undertook a fleet exchange with Pakistan International Airlines, swapping its fleet of 4 Boeing 747-200s for PIA's fleet of 5 Douglas DC-10s, the trijets presenting improvements to fuel economy over the 747s. In 1984, CP Air launched an airline within itself in the form of Attaché, a business-class offshoot working out of Toronto, which charged a 5% higher fare for business travellers while presenting a modified series of Boeing 737-200s and later 300s with a more spacious interior, luxury in-flight service, and priority baggage and check-in. Its routes including 3 daily services between Winnipeg, Halifax and Toronto, and 2 daily flights between Toronto and Vancouver, the attaché concept ultimately failing to win over the passenger numbers desired, as business users chose Air Canada's more reasonable fares. Regardless, CP Air continued to expand its operations, primarily into Asia, considering that the more routes it served in direct competition with Air Canada would help increase its passenger numbers and market share. But with the economic recession caused by the 1979 and 1980 oil crises lingering well into the new decade, CP Air was eventually saddled with a debt of $1 billion Canadian dollars, forcing the company to search for a potential merger in order to combine assets and save itself financially. To keep its fiscal situation afloat, CP Air entered discussions with other ailing Canadian carriers, most of whom had lost their strategic advantages with the deregulation of the airline industry, as to purchases and mergers, the first being Eastern Provincial Airlines or EPA, a Gander-based regional carrier, the alliance of these 2 airlines allowing CP Air access to EPA's extensive routes east of Montreal, of which the former had a threadbare network, while the rival Air Canada had a strong presence in this region following its purchase of Air Alliance to form Air Nova in 1986. With the purchase of EPA, CP Air reverted back to its original title of Canadian Pacific, and adopted a new, more corporate livery of white with a red waistband and a dark blue tail and underbelly, the branding of this newly revived Canadian Pacific having its English title on one side of the aircraft and the French equivalent, Canadian Pacific, on the other side in order to reflect its new routes within Quebec. While in October 1985, Canadian Pacific announced it would also merge with Nordair, a Montreal-based carrier which provided both international and domestic services. However, the merger of Nordair and EPA into CP Air to form the revived Canadian Pacific did not stem the airline's outflow, and less than a year later, PWA Corp., parent company of Canadian domestic carrier Pacific Western Airlines, purchased CP Air for $300 million, creating Canadian Airlines International, followed in 1989 by the addition of the ailing Wardair, which had been suffering financial woes since as early as 1987 due to their rapid expansion, a failure to attract business customers, and the shambolic introduction of a new computer booking system, presenting Canadian with several much-desired routes to the UK and Europe, and thereby cementing the carrier as the second largest airline in Canada. Establishing hubs at the former bases of the 3 airlines which had come together to form the carrier, CP Air's former headquarters at Vancouver, PWA's base at Calgary, and Wardair and EPA's base at Montreal, as well as a new hub in Toronto, the priority of Canadian Airlines and its holding company, the Canadian Airlines Corporation, was to streamline its operations by way of replacing the aging fleet of its precursors with a vast new fleet of airliners, including the long-awaited arrival of Boeing 767-300ERs from 1988, Boeing 747-400s from 1990, and Airbus A320s to replace older Boeing 737s on trunk domestic operations. The Canadian Airlines holding company not only oversaw the operation of Canadian Airlines International, but was also the majority shareholder of several other regional carriers within Canada, including Time Air, Air Atlantic, Ontario Express, and Canadian Regional, while in 1989 the group launched a dedicated domestic airline which would serve the northern provinces of Canada, dubbed Canadian North. The airline, based in Ottawa, using Boeing 737-200s and de Havilland Dash 8s, specially modified with gravel kits and skis to work vital freight and passenger flights to destinations such as Yellowknife in the Northwest Territories and Iqaluit in Nunavut, located on Baffin Island near the Arctic Circle. In April 1993, Canadian launched another dedicated domestic carrier named Canadian Regional, which, based out of Calgary, operated an extensive internal network across western and midwestern Canada, while the airline's diversification also saw it operate the largest tour operator in the country called Canadian Holidays and the Canadian Getaways program, which flew to destinations across North and South America, as well as a cargo arm called Canadian Air Cargo, which provided general air cargo services in Canada and the United States. Canadian Airlines was also an industry leader when it came to an online presence, as in April 1994 the company became the first airline in the world to start its own website as www.cdnair.ca. This distinction also including it being the first website with transactional capabilities, such as flight arrival and departure times and fare information, the website being the product of Grant Fengstad, senior technology analyst at the airline, who predicted that the use of the internet would revolutionize the travel sector, beginning what would become a rapidly spreading trend among other companies to create their own web pages in a similar vein. Unfortunately, Canadian Airlines' place as the promising competitor to Air Canada was very short-lived, as due to the 1991 Gulf War, during which the armies of Iraqi dictator Saddam Hussein set fire to oil wells in Kuwait as they retreated in the face of advancing coalition forces, a major spike in oil prices and a subsequent recession caused airline revenues to drop dramatically, and with Canadian having inherited the substantial debts of its bankrupt and near-bankrupt progenitors, it had to wipe clean 700 million Canadian dollars worth of debts, which almost resulted in its collapse as early as 1994. The company only saved through direct injections of cash from American Airlines, before the US carrier took a 33% share in the airline's holding company from 1995. On November 1, 1996, Kevin Benson, the president and CEO, launched a comprehensive restructuring scheme to revitalize the airline's profitability, which included a 4-year plan which would address the main issues of cost control, revenue growth, capitalization, and fleet renewal, phasing out the older Douglas DC-10s and Boeing 737-200s in favor of newer models, including potentially Airbus A330s and additional Boeing 767s, while in order to try and retain customers, the airline introduced the largest frequent flyer program in Canada with Canadian Plus, which covered 60 airline, hotel, car rental, and financial partners worldwide, and had more than 3 million members. Further to the corporate restructuring, Canadian once again expanded its operations to areas where Air Canada had little or no presence, specifically in the Far East, opening up destinations in the Philippines and Indonesia, flying more services between Canada and the Orient than any other of the nation's airlines, although this distinction was one which would come to ultimately spell the firm's protracted demise, as within 18 months of this ambitious new network of Far Eastern routes being established, the 1997 Asian financial crisis had begun, an economic meltdown caused by the floating of Thailand's currency, the baht, on the stock market, which led to fears of a looming global recession and a market disturbance that spread across the nations of Eastern and Southern Asia. Canadian, which had invested large amounts of its already fragile capital into these new Asian routes, took the impact of the recession hard, with passenger numbers on these services plummeting, and thus meaning the carrier was unable to recoup its sizable investment into this new network. The carrier, in partnership with American Airlines, opting to join the proposed airline alliance of oneworld, which was established on September 21, 1998, following a conference between these two carriers and other formative partners, British Airways, Cathay Pacific and Qantas, the group becoming effective from February 1, 1999. With the new One World Alliance, aside from allowing for better travel arrangements between the member airlines through code shares and cooperating frequent flyer programs, it also meant that financial support between the carriers could be provided, the hope being that the fiscal support of its One World partners would keep Canadian Airlines afloat and allow it to repay its debts on the failing Asian network, reflecting this new membership by way of a revised corporate livery by replacing the chevron, which dated back to the 1968 CP Air livery, with a Canada goose with swept wings up the tail and along the rear fuselage. However, Canadians' future prospects would all but evaporate during the same year, as by late 1999, in a bid led by partner American Airlines, which itself was managed by former CP Air CEO Donald J. Carty, the company embarked on a fierce takeover battle for Air Canada, proposing the purchase of controlling shares, funded by both American and Canadian Airlines, in the national carrier in order to force it out of the rival Star Alliance group and bring it into the ranks of One World, thus strengthening the latter's position within the aviation market. In response, on August 20, 1999, Air Canada proposed a financial offer to purchase Canadians' international routes and airport slots, while relegating the company to solely a domestic operation, followed 4 days later by a takeover bid from the Onex Corporation, a Canadian private equity firm, which was backed by American Airlines at a cost of 1.8 billion Canadian dollars, and an assumption of 3.9 billion Canadian dollars in debt, Canadian Airlines management recommending this takeover bid and requesting support from its shareholders, although Air Canada promptly rejected the Onex offer. On October 19, 1999, Air Canada, with the support of its more financially stable Star Alliance partners, Lufthansa, United Airlines, and the Canadian Imperial Bank of Commerce, announced a 930 million Canadian dollar counterbid to the Onex offer, Air Canada offering 92 million Canadian dollars for an 82% controlling share in Canadian Airlines and committing to operate it as a separate firm, increasing its offer to 16 Canadian dollars a share to buy back 36.4% of the airline from November, the decision eventually coming down to a high court in Quebec, which declared on November 5th that the Onex takeover was illegal due to legislative stipulations that no more than 10% of the company could be controlled by a single shareholder. The result was Onex withdrawing its offer, giving Air Canada free rein to acquire Canadian Airlines, the company board, on December 4th, officially recommending that shareholders accept the 92 million Canadian dollar offer, and Air Canada officially took control of Canadian Airlines, pending government approval, on December 8, 1999, the Federal Competition Bureau allowing this takeover to take place on December 21st, and Canadian Airlines officially becoming a subsidiary of Air Canada 2 days later. With Canadian now firmly in the hands of Air Canada, the airline's operations were gradually wound up throughout 2000, and although the company continued to operate independently during that year, as its various assets and systems were reorganized and reallocated to its new owner, the impending demise of Canadian could be seen as its fleet of airliners were repainted into Air Canada's white and black with red maple leaf livery, Canadian Airlines eventually coming to an end as an independent company on January 1, 2001, ending its 59-year rivalry and Canada's second airline.